It was January 2018, and a headline was ripping across newswires so fast that editors barely had time to check it before publishing. A computer had done what 6 centuries of human beings could not. Cryptographers, physicists, mathematicians, FBI codebreakers, and even Alan Turing's own wartime codebreaking team had all tried and failed. Now, a university lab in Alberta, Canada, was claiming that artificial intelligence had cracked the most mysterious book on the planet, a 240-page medieval text called the Voynich Manuscript. Reporters were calling relatives, professors were refreshing their inboxes, and for a few electric hours it looked like one of history's oldest unsolved puzzles had finally given up its secret. Then, almost as fast as the story broke, something strange happened. The same experts who should have been celebrating started sounding the alarm. Within days, the celebration turned into one of the most public academic pylons the field had seen in years. So what did the AI actually find? Why did it fall apart so quickly, and is there any chance it was onto something after all? To understand why this claim detonated the way it did, you have to understand exactly what this book is and why it has broken the mind of everyone who has ever tried to read it. In 2009, scientists at the University of Arizona ran radiocarbon dating on 4 samples of that vellum and came back with 95% certainty that the material was produced somewhere between 1404 and 1438, placing the book squarely in the early 15th century, deep in the late Middle Ages. That single scientific result matters more than almost anything else in this story because it rules out an enormous number of theories before they even get started. And then there's the section that everyone remembers. Page after page of naked women bathing, swimming, and floating in pools, connected by a bizarre network of green tubes and pipes, some of which appear to mimic the shape of the human reproductive system. There is a section that looks pharmaceutical, filled with jars and labeled plant roots, and dense blocks of text that some researchers believe are recipes or instructions. Historians have grouped all of this into 6 loose categories based purely on the pictures, because nobody has ever been able to read a single word attached to any of them. For over 100 years, that has been the maddening part. Researchers have counted somewhere between 20 and 25 distinct recurring characters in the script, arranged left to right, with clear internal rules about which letters can start a word, which can sit in the middle, and which can end one, exactly the kind of structural behavior you would expect from a real language. In 1944, cryptanalyst Elizabeth Friedman, one of the most accomplished codebreakers in American history, warned that anyone who attempted to translate it was doomed to utter frustration. She was right. Every single professional code-breaking approach, every statistical trick, every substitution cipher method that had cracked far more sophisticated wartime codes has walked away from Voynich's empty-handed. Part of the problem is that there is no Rosetta Stone. Every other ancient script that has ever been successfully decoded, from Egyptian hieroglyphics to Linear B, was cracked because researchers eventually found a second version of the same text written in a language they already understood. And that absence is exactly what has made the manuscript such fertile ground for wild theories, from secret alchemical societies to, yes, actual aliens, with one persistent internet theory holding that a stranded extraterrestrial visitor spent his final years on Earth quietly illustrating a coloring book about his home planet. Long before any computer got involved, the list of people who had failed to crack this book reads like a hall of fame of code breaking. Professional cryptologists tried it. FBI operatives reportedly took a pass at it during idle hours. Respected medievalists, mathematicians, and skilled linguists all lined up over the decades and all walked away with nothing. Even Alan Turing's own wartime code-breaking circle, the team that tore through some of the most sophisticated military ciphers in human history at Bletchley Park, could not find a single reliable foothold in Voynich's. That track record is exactly why, by the 21st century, with human cryptographers thoroughly stumped, a new kind of question started circulating in computer science departments. If a machine could process the statistical fingerprints of hundreds of languages in seconds, could it succeed where human intuition had failed for 600 years? In 2016, a natural language processing researcher named Greg Kondrak at the University of Alberta, working with his graduate student Bradley Hauer, decided to find out. Their approach was clever precisely because it was modest. By comparing letter frequencies, common letter pairings, and word length patterns across all those translations, the algorithm learned what researchers described as the statistical fingerprint of each language, essentially a numerical DNA signature unique to every tongue. The AI never understood a single word of meaning in any of these languages. It simply learned what the shape of each language looked like on the page. Then the researchers pointed it at the Voynich Manuscript and asked a simple question: which of these 380 statistical fingerprints does this text most resemble? The results stunned everyone involved. The algorithm had been expected to point towards something European, maybe Italian or Latin, given where the vellum was likely produced. It was a strange and elaborate theory, but it gave the team a testable idea, and testable ideas are exactly what 600 years of guesswork had been missing. To prove it, the researchers did not attempt to translate the entire manuscript at once. The first attempt came back as pure gibberish, so the team stepped in by hand, adjusting spellings, inserting vowels they judged were missing, and nudging the reconstructed text closer to something that resembled real Hebrew grammar. Once they had a version they were satisfied with, they dropped it into Google Translate and asked for an English translation. What came out stopped the room. A full, grammatically coherent English sentence emerged from 600 years of silence. Translated, it read roughly as, "She made recommendations to the priest, man of the house, and me and people." Kondrak told reporters the sentence was genuinely grammatical and could be interpreted, and he called it a real breakthrough. It had an odd, almost scriptural cadence to it, like a fragment pulled from an old letter or a piece of religious correspondence. Encouraged by that result, the team went further, picking out a handful of individual Voynich words, mostly from the plant-heavy sections of the manuscript, that seemed to correspond to simple Hebrew nouns like light, fire, farmer, and air, once the same anagram and vowel rules were applied. Outlets across Canada, the United States, and Europe picked up variations of the same story, that a 600-year-old mystery that had defeated the sharpest minds in history, including Alan Turing's own code-breaking team, had finally fallen to a university computer lab. For a few days, it genuinely looked like the book was about to give up everything it had been hiding since the 15th century. Then the backlash arrived, and it arrived fast. Within days, medievalist Damian Fleming at Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, was publicly picking the study apart on social media. His objection was not with the statistical language identification step, which most researchers agreed had been done using legitimate methods. His objection was with everything that came after it. Other researchers zeroed in on a detail that had been almost buried in the original coverage, that Hebrew had not won by a landslide at all. The second highest scoring language in the algorithm's ranking was Malay, a language with no historical, geographic, or linguistic connection to Hebrew whatsoever. Computational linguist Shlomo Argamon pointed out that some language has to come out on top in any ranking system, and a near tie between two completely unrelated languages was a red flag, not a triumph, suggesting the algorithm might simply be picking the best of a weak field rather than genuinely identifying the correct language. Then there was the translation process itself. Critics noted that the AI's raw output was not readable Hebrew at all. It only became readable after human researchers manually corrected spellings, added vowels they guessed were missing, and shaped the result into something a translation tool could work with. And that translation tool was the real sticking point. Google Translate is built for modern conversational Hebrew, not a possibly encrypted medieval dialect. And critics argued that Google's algorithms are specifically designed to always output something that sounds like fluent language, even when fed nonsense, essentially smoothing garbage into grammar. Lisa Fagan-Davis put it bluntly, saying that leaning on Google instead of a genuine expert in historical Hebrew was going to cost the study credibility, and it did. Nick Pelling, a researcher who has spent decades studying Voynich ciphers, was asked directly how likely he thought the Hebrew decoding was to be correct. His answer was that the odds were so close to zero it made no practical difference. Technology journalist James Vincent wrote that the sentence, while technically grammatical, read like something that could have been produced by a dog walking across a keyboard hooked up to Google Translate, and that one coherent sentence proves nothing about an entire 240-page manuscript. Even Kondrak himself, to his credit, acknowledged that confirming any of it would require a genuine expert in ancient Hebrew willing to take on the rest of the puzzle, something that, years later, still has not happened. The alphagram hypothesis itself, the idea that vowels were stripped and letters were scrambled, was never proven. In fact, the Hebrew theory itself was not even new in 2018. Back in 2016, 2 different computer scientists had announced they had translated entire sentences of the manuscript by simply typing recognizable Hebrew-looking letters into Google Translate, producing the sentence, "She made recommendations to the priest, men of the house, and me and people," a result nearly identical to Kondrak and Hauer's later work, and one that actual Hebrew experts dismissed as not even close to real Hebrew. There was also German Egyptologist Rainer Hannig, who claimed to have identified Voynich as a Semitic language rooted in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Arabic, and managed to translate what he described as full sentences, though he admitted it would take years to complete the entire manuscript, and experts in ancient Hebrew were not convinced he had cracked anything at all. Then, in May 2019, the University of Bristol put out a press release announcing that one of its own researchers, Dr. Gerard Cheshire, had cracked the manuscript's code in just 2 weeks. The backlash hit even faster than it had for the AI study the year before. Lisa Fagan-Davis, again at the center of the pushback, called the entire proto-romance theory nonsense, explaining that she had tried to reproduce Cheshire's method years earlier and found that the letter substitutions were so subjective you could essentially bend them into whatever word you wanted depending on what answer you were hoping to find. Bristol pulled the article from its own website within a day, citing serious concerns about the validity of the research, an almost unheard of retraction from a major university. 2 years before that, in 2017, television writer Nicholas Gibbs made international headlines claiming the manuscript was a women's health manual written in abbreviated medieval Latin, a theory that also collapsed once actual Latin scholars examined his translations and found them to be largely incoherent. Every single one of them, without exception, has eventually been debunked, dismantled, or quietly abandoned once independent experts tried to reproduce the results. As one technology outlet dryly put it after the Bristol fallout, another day, another dubious claim that someone has decoded the Voynich Manuscript. There's a darker theory running underneath all of this that questions whether there is anything to decode at all. In 2004, researcher Gordon Rugg proposed that the entire manuscript could have been generated using a device called a cardon grill, essentially a piece of cardboard with holes cut into it that gets slid over a table of pre-written word fragments, prefixes, roots, and suffixes, allowing someone to mechanically generate word after word that statistically resembles a real language without any of it meaning anything whatsoever. Rugg pointed to the unusually even, repetitive structure of Voynich word lengths as evidence that the text might have been manufactured rather than written organically. There is a serious hole in this theory, though. The cardon grill was not invented until 1550 by Girolamo Cardano, more than a century after the manuscript's vellum has been radiocarbon dated to. Rugg has argued that an earlier version of the tool may have existed and simply been lost to history, or that the manuscript was written later using old parchment stock that had been sitting around unused for decades. But neither explanation has ever been definitively proven, and the timeline gap remains one of the biggest unresolved problems on either side of the hoax argument. Adding another layer of complexity, researchers studying the raw text using a mathematical concept called information entropy, essentially a measure of how predictable a piece of writing is, found that Voynichese does not behave like random gibberish at all. Random nonsense tends to score very high on this measure because nothing about it follows a pattern. Real human languages score much lower because certain letters and word combinations repeat constantly in predictable ways. The Voynich script scores low too, sitting much closer to real language behavior than to random noise, which is exactly the kind of evidence that keeps serious researchers convinced there might be genuine meaning buried in there somewhere. The unsettling part is that Rugg's mechanical cardon grill method can accidentally recreate that same statistical signature, meaning both sides of the argument, the believers and the hoax theorists, can point at the exact same data and walk away with completely opposite conclusions. The ownership history of the book is nearly as tangled as the text itself, and just as full of gaps. The earliest confirmed owner on record is Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who ruled from 1576 to 1612 and reportedly purchased the manuscript for 600 gold ducats, believing at the time that it had been written by the medieval English philosopher Roger Bacon. That claim survives only through a letter written decades later by a Prague physician named Johannes Marcus Marci, addressed to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome. And there is no surviving imperial record actually confirming the sale ever happened, leading some historians to treat the whole 600 ducat story as legend rather than documented fact. From Rudolph, the manuscript is believed to have passed to his court physician and eventually to an alchemist named Georg Barisch, who could not read it either, and in 1639 wrote to Kircher himself begging for help, describing the book as a certain riddle of the Sphinx that was uselessly taking up space on his shelf. There is even a lingering theory that Voynich forged the entire thing himself between 1900 and 1912, using genuine antique vellum to fake its age, partly because his own account of discovering the book contains inconsistencies when compared to a separate version his wife told later, and partly because he had a documented history involving forged passports and revolutionary activity earlier in his life. But the 2009 radiocarbon dating result is a serious obstacle for that theory, since it confirms the vellum itself genuinely dates back to the early 1400s, centuries before Voynich was even born, though supporters of the forgery theory point out that old blank vellum could theoretically have been reused by a later forger. Eventually, the manuscript was donated to Yale, where it remains today, still drawing researchers, still fueling controversy, and still refusing to give up a single confirmed sentence of meaning. So where does that leave the AI claim, and where does it leave us? What the Kondrak and Hauer study actually demonstrated was something genuinely useful, a real statistical signal pointing toward Hebrew as a possible root language, published through legitimate peer review in a respected academic journal. What it did not demonstrate, despite the headlines, was an actual translation. The single sentence that made international news was built on an unproven anagram hypothesis, corrected by hand in multiple places, and ultimately produced by a modern consumer translation tool never designed for a 600-year-old, possibly deliberately scrambled script. This episode also became something of an accidental case study in how modern artificial intelligence actually works and where its limits sit. When an AI system does not have enough reliable information to work with, it can produce something researchers call a hallucination, an answer that sounds fluent and convincing, but is not actually grounded in truth. Feed a system trained mostly on modern love letters and encrypted passage of Shakespeare, and it might confidently generate a fluent, grammatically perfect sentence about modern romance that has absolutely nothing to do with what Shakespeare actually wrote. Many researchers now believe that is essentially what happened here. An AI system doing exactly what it was built to do, finding the closest statistical match it possibly could, and outputting it with total confidence. Whether or not that match had anything to do with reality, none of this means artificial intelligence is finished trying to crack the Voynich Manuscript. If future systems are trained on richer datasets built specifically from medieval texts, 15th century manuscripts, and historical Hebrew, Latin, and Italian sources from the actual era the book was written in, rather than modern translations, some researchers believe the results could look very different and far more credible. But for now, after more than 60 published solutions, after Latin abbreviation theories, proto-romance theories, alien visitor theories, card and grill hoax theories, and now an AI-powered Hebrew anagram theory, the Voynich Manuscript remains exactly where it has always been, sealed inside a temperature-controlled vault at Yale, its pages still covered in flowing letters nobody alive can read, its illustrations still just as strange, its history still full of 250-year gaps nobody can explain. Every attempt to crack it has produced the same result, a burst of excitement, a wave of headlines, and then a quiet, careful walk back once real experts get a close look. Maybe that persistence is the actual point of this story. 6 centuries, the sharpest cryptographers in history, Alan Turing himself, and now one of the most powerful pattern recognition tools humanity has ever built, and the book still has not said a single confirmed word. So here is the real question worth sitting with. If artificial intelligence keeps getting more powerful every single year, is it only a matter of time before something finally reads this book? Or is the Voynich Manuscript the one mystery specifically built to outlast every tool we ever throw at it?